So I wanted to start this morning with this reminder that last year around this time, around Easter, actually on Easter Sunday, we started this conversation called Cruciform. And really what we were trying to do last year was acknowledge that times have changed. And for many of us, thinking about the cross and the idea of a God who would sacrifice his son is a really difficult thing to get our brains around. And so we spent a lot of energy on that last year. And if those are questions that you have as you move toward Easter, we would just point you back to those podcasts. We're not going to do a Cruciform series this year, but we're in Easter, and we're in that season. And so to me, a great jumping off point is this reminder that the cross is this thing that we all have to work through on our own, and it's not the kind of work that I can do for you or someone else can do for me. It's this very personalized, messy thing. And we're going to kind of jump back into that work over these next few weeks. So let me just kind of give you a little bit of a snapshot of the next few weeks, because we're not framing it with series the way we normally would. But this week, you may or may not know that this is what many would call Palm Sunday. So this would be 7 days before Jesus walked out of the tomb alive. He walked into Jerusalem, a bit of a hero, a folk hero of sorts, someone who they were looking at to accomplish some pretty big things. 4 days later, on Thursday, Jesus was arrested. Day after that, he was killed. We call that Good Friday. And then, of course, on Sunday, he walked out of the tomb alive, or at least that's the claim of historic followers of Jesus. And so we're going to step into that kind of season. I have a friend who said to me, not kind of an old mentor, who said to me a couple months ago, he said anymore when he talks to people about faith, he frames it in 3 questions. He said, first of all, I say to them, and which I guess I would say to you, are you open to the idea that the story actually happened, that Jesus was a historical person and the events of his life celebrated by followers of Jesus are in fact true? And his point was that if I am, then that's something we can help one another with. We can together open up those ideas. It's a faith in the end. It's not a fact thing. It's a faith thing. But we can help one another in choosing whether or not to believe that story actually occurred. Which leads to a second question of, are you open to the idea that if it actually happened, that the story is grand, that it's magnificent, that it's awesome in the truest sense of the word? Which is to say that if it happened, if the claims are true, then the implications are profound. That if true, then it completely changes the way we see the world, the way we see one another. Resurrection doesn't just apply to Jesus on Easter Sunday, but it applies to all people and all creation, and a God who has not abandoned, but is committed to putting things back to rights. And if you're open to that, that's the type of thing we can help one another with. And in many senses, that's what Sundays are all about. That's what we do, is we're constantly opening up that conversation of what would be the implications of things if it was true. The third question is, are you grateful? My friend's point is that third question is one that I can't help you with and you can't help me with. That's something you got to work on your own. That gratitude, which some of us would call salvation and others would call conversion or getting saved, or however it is you frame that, that's a very personal thing. But I say all that to say, in my mind, the things that I gravitate toward, the ways that I like to think, the studies that I like to do, I think we spend a lot of time on that second question. Are you open to the idea that if it actually happened, then that's incredible? And we're going to spend some time on that this morning. The first question, though, is a bit of an apologetic. Are you open to the idea that the story actually occurred? And in my mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but I think Easter's a unique opportunity to ask the hard questions of the historic probability, the viability of the story historically. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit about that and the resurrection. April 28th, we're going to spend some more time on that very piece of, was it historical? This morning, I want to return to the idea of, is it grand? And if true, are you open to the idea that it's grand? Because Palm Sunday, to me, is a really refreshing day. Listen, if you're not familiar with church, or you've been turned off by it for years, or you're really not sure what you think of it right now, I would guess that one of the perceptions that bug you is that we just slap smiley faces on everything. Funerals, weddings that nobody feels good about, we just read a verse and pray a prayer, and suddenly we're all supposed to smile. I think Easter, ironically, is an opportunity to point out that the original story wasn't all smiles. We celebrate Christmas, and we often forget the pain that people are going through, but the original story is, it's heinous. It's brutal. And so it's an opportunity to step in and go, this is tough. Easter's all the same, especially, I think, Palm Sunday. So I think a great jumping off point is to go, in what ways are you disappointed with God? And I don't say that, we can stir things up and make people angry for the sake of, in what ways don't you like your boss? And you might not have even thought about the fact you didn't like your boss, but suddenly if someone gives you permission, you got lots of reasons. I don't mean it like that. But I think there's some things that are helpful to acknowledge, maybe where you're discouraged, maybe where you're bothered, and maybe where you're feeling a little let down by God is, frankly, CNN and Fox News and wherever it is you get your news. Because your life's pretty good, and you understand you have some friends that things aren't going so well. But when you look at the greater scope of the planet, it's troubling. When you look at sex trafficking and the types of things that Love Justice works on, that we're going to help them next weekend with the race, when you look at some of the things happening in places like Iraq, when you look at the greater scope of the world, it's hard for you to swallow this religious pill. And I think one of the things that's helpful to name is that you're carrying a burden that the vast majority of humans who ever lived didn't carry. Because most humans, they knew suffering. They had to deal with that, but it was localized. They might have an earthquake, but they didn't have them every day. Now, if you want, you can have one every day because you get to look at all the world's bad news. And that can become overwhelming and discouraging to faith. For some of you, you wish it was that easy. For some of you, it's the events of your own life. Tragic loss of a spouse or a friend, a loved one, a business, maybe a reputation. That's painful. Maybe an income. And there's this profound disconnect between the God you want to believe in and the circumstances that are unfolding. For some of you, maybe your issue isn't with God and you're not discouraged with God or in any way just kind of let down by God in general, but the particulars, like the faith you grew up in, the institution that you knew, the boxes and the formulas, they just perpetually let you down. And so for you, it's frankly quite a commentary that you're even here. And this would really apply to many of you, I would suspect. Because you don't have a problem with God. You can walk out your house and you see grace, you see beauty, you see good. It's not lost on you that there's also bad. But to drill it down to someone as specific as Jesus, that's tough. And again, in our multicultural, post-Christian, postmodern world, of course it's tough. We're dealing with questions intellectually and spiritually and emotionally that most cultures didn't have to deal with. They didn't have to confront as many other faith claims, perhaps, as we do. Some, but not all. So what I want to jump into is this idea of discouragement and being let down. And actually, I think it's also personal because I don't know about you, but my worst moments are when things don't go my way. Right? And I bumped into, there's a guy, Jonathan Narrate. I'm going to actually plagiarize his book on Ales Weekend. He wrote a book called Learning to Speak God from Scratch, and it's he has a really good general concept there that you can read the book if you want, or you can just take the plagiarized 30-second or 30-minute version on May 19th. But he points in his book to a study that was published in the New York Times that was all about disappointment with God. Or not disappointment with God, just disappointment in general. And in fact, the article starts as kind of anticlimactic by saying, disappointment is one of life's hardest things to manage, which you go duh. But the part of the study that was really helpful to me, if only I could translate it into my daily behavior more effectively, is that now there's a brain science attached to the way that we deal with disappointment. Because this article was documenting some brain research that had been done that was saying that actually now that they can see, first of all, and you may or may not know this already, that your brain loves to predict the future. It loves to tell you things that are going to happen out in front, whether that's the light's going to be green, or you're going to make your flight, or you're going to get the job, or he's going to say yes, whatever it is, you're going to win the game. Our brains love to predict the future, but what I didn't know prior to reading this research is you actually get a dopamine hit when your brain does that. Part of the reason why we love to set goals and have visions and make plans is because that happy chemical that we crave, and the very same thing that gets us addicted to all kinds of legal and illegal substances and other things like sex and other things, dopamine, that thing that in many ways we live for, when your brain starts predicting the future and it feels possible, you get shots of dopamine within your system. And then, when it actually occurs, when the prom goes as well as you had hoped, when your team wins, when the superstar that your team signs actually helps you win the championship, when the business actually works out, when the light's actually green, you get a double dose of dopamine. Now, that's all kind of self-evident, right? But here's the part that helped me understand why I'm such an imbecile when things don't go my way, is what the brain science is now pointing out, is that when things don't occur, when the light's red, so to speak, the opposite occurs, and your system goes from dopamine plus the anticipation of a double dose of dopamine to nothing instantly, which is why you suddenly are moronic, right? Now, I have a friend who plays in the band, Zach. I remember him years ago. He said, we were setting up, and he was putting his in-ear earbuds in, and he said, man, I'm ready. Just install the things in my head. You know, he's putting his earbuds in. He's like, I wear them all day long. As soon as I have the technology, they can just put the earbuds in my head. I don't think I'm on board for that. I think that was pre-AirPod, and I'm like, let's split the difference. Let's go with the AirPod. But would you sign up for a little digital LCD screen on your wrist? There's actually a name for this dopamine dropout. It's called reward prediction error. That's the scientific name for what happens here, is reward prediction error. Meaning your system was projecting, we can go to that next slide. Your system was projecting something, it didn't happen, bam. Like I would totally sign up for a little 4-inch LCD screen on my wrist, wouldn't you? That was connected to my bloodstream. I don't want an Apple Watch. If it could do this, maybe I would sign up for that. That when the call is a ball, not a strike, and my system goes through reward prediction error, it could save me a lot of trouble. If it just, oh yeah, okay. I have a shock collar for my dog, and I almost never have to use it. There's just the audible version that you use, and my friends who understand this stuff, they say actually all you're doing is deer, 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 deer. Oh, okay, yeah, remember, human. You're just pulling them away from distraction. Wouldn't that be awesome? If the next time your system was going through reward prediction error, it just got shocked, and you're like, oh yeah, which would cue you to what? Go home, close the shades, don't talk to anybody, don't send any text messages, don't email anybody. In fact, just put everybody on alert, you're not interacting with anybody till the sun comes up. Don't drink anything, just isolate. Why? Because I don't know about you, but this is where my brokenness is the worst. Well, here's where I think this is relevant. Palm Sunday, we celebrate it, and maybe you've been a part of different traditions that have celebrated it with all kinds of lofty joy and excitement. I'd like to propose, and I'm indebted to Jonathan Narrate, to be honest, that Palm Sunday it's reward prediction error in mass. Consider the story. Jesus, this renegade rabbi, shows up in Jerusalem with his band of co-conspirators. They emerge from this dusty, dry, hot wilderness. We would call it desert, they would call it wilderness. They start making their way into Jerusalem. And to picture that, I've actually walked that road a couple times. Some of you have as well. But to picture that, really just picture, what is that horrible spine when you're coming down Mount Helena? I can never remember the name of that trail, where if you fall, you're going to get 10 stitches. No, not the power line. What's the one over? The Prospect Shaft. That's what I'm looking for, right? Don't fall, because you know how when you come down Prospect Shaft, you can you're just looking into downtown Helena. That's really what this road that they were coming off of the Mount of Olives into. You can see right down to the top of the Temple Mount. And Jesus did a very peculiar thing. Up until this point in his life, it was always low key. He would heal somebody and go, don't tell anybody. He would teach something, he'd say, but don't tell him where you learned that. He would heal somebody. He would do some kind of crazy thing, and it was always the opposite of a PR director. He was constantly trying to erase his name from public record. In this case, he shows up in Jerusalem, and it's he throws himself a giant parade and draws tons and tons of attention to himself. Let me read it, and we'll offer a couple comments. But I think it's an invitation to maybe step into Easter, not being begged to fake it till you make it, but to step into the real raw emotion that I think Easter would have really been experienced in. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, someone asked me this morning, Adam, could you slow down when you read the verse? And I said, I could. I've been trying for 20 years. So let me try. Saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. This is Zechariah. Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did as Jesus instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on them. So first and foremost, what we see is Jesus, he's playing into an ancient prophecy that said, your king shows up on some kind of four-legged creature. And that's a big deal, because when someone rides into town on a four-legged creature, that's telling you something. When someone in your city lands in Air Force One, that's telling you there's somebody important in town. That's what's going on here. So Jesus steps into this idea that he's a big deal, and he's raising expectations. Point being, his showing up instantly raises everybody's dopamine levels because they've been living underneath this foreign regime for years, and he shows up proclaiming, and they know this is the guy who just not that long ago was in a little village called Bethany, and his buddy Lazarus, he was dead, but he decided he had died too early, and so he called Lazarus back out of the tomb alive. They know what he's capable of. And up until this point, he's resisted these kinds of moments. Not now. He's finally like, okay, I'll take the office. Let's go for this thing. Big, big levels of dopamine. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted. And here, this is quotes from Psalm 118, that if you read Psalm 118, the gist of it is, God's going to kick our enemies' butts. Who are they? Whoever our enemies are, he doesn't like them. That's really the gist. Hosanna, which means save us now. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? In fact, that word stirred there, it's the Greek word seismic, which probably nobody here even needs me to translate the implications of that. It's like Texas, it's like Lubbock, Texas, after Texas Tech made it to the championship game. Did you see that? Like they lit the streets on fire. The place is just vibrating with anticipation. Great excitement. They're cutting off branches. They're throwing their coats on the road. They're screaming and carrying on. This is the big deal. And Jesus seems to be stepping into the expectations that come with it. See, what they would have known that we don't necessarily know, what Matthew would have assumed, I believe his authors would have known, was that 200 years prior to this, 200 years prior to this, another man showed up, Judas Maccabeus. He showed up in Jerusalem. He showed up, and they threw palm branches on the ground and coats on the floor, and they sang Psalm 118 to him, and guess what he did? He raised a sword, and he kicked some butt. This was like a new golden era for Jerusalem. He kicked the king of Syria out of Israel. He purified the temple, and for 100 years, the reason why in the apocryphal books we have a couple books named after this guy is because for 100 years, it was like the ideal version of Israel again. And Jesus steps in, just 100 years removed from that generation ending, 200 years removed from that event, which means he's closer to that than we are to George Washington, right? And he does all the same stuff. I would like to contend that people didn't sleep well that night. Like they had that thing that happens before the game, before the job interview, before the move. They're just vibrating with dopamine. They can't believe they actually lived to see the day that God was going to send the next David he was going to do some damage. He was going to reestablish their sovereignty. He was going to reestablish he's king. And then what happens? Monday comes and Jesus doesn't brandish a sword. And Tuesday comes and Jesus just continues to talk about, he's the leader of a kingdom, but a different kind of kingdom. This kingdom's about valuing people, not institutions. This kingdom doesn't play by the rules of the world. This kingdom's not going to come about by starting a war. And what happens? Reward prediction error. How do we know that? Because the very same crowd that on Sunday that was screaming, Hosanna, Hosanna, God, save us now, you're the guy, you're the guy. By Thursday, they were shouting, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Reward prediction error in mass. And so we come along 2,000 years later and we talk about Palm Sunday, and I would argue if we're not careful, we avoid the real challenges of it. Because don't we do the same thing? We, with the best of intentions, we form our own images of God, don't we? Whether that's by watching the History Channel, or that's because you were raised in a Baptist home, we form our own images of God, whether they're Christian or otherwise, whether they live on this continent or another one. And frankly, we form images that are convenient to our needs. If you're like me and you're an anxious person, you like a God who protects and leads and rescues. If you're someone who likes stuff and security, you like a God who's a keen financial manager who will always reward you when you do the right thing with your stuff. If you're a crazy adventure person, you play rugby. Just kidding. If you're a crazy adventure person, you like a God who isn't all that concerned with security and some of those dumb things. Those are idols to you. You like a God who's always looking for something to conquer, something grand to do. If someone in your life is ill, if you've lost your health, He's a healer. And the problem is all those things have verses that you can support with it and religions that you can bring alongside of it, and we just build and build and build our image of God, and then what? Reward prediction error. And despite what we were told as we were growing up, if we did X, Y, and Z, our marriage would look like this. Despite what we were told, if we led our business this way, we would be successful in these ways. It doesn't happen. And we know this. I think the real question is, does God know this? Does the ancient tradition of people who have tried to follow God, did they know this? Or is it true that if you just get God right, you don't ever experience this? And the bottom falls out. And we're left either picking a new tradition, deciding the whole thing is a load, or putting a smiley face on top of something that's rotten underneath, or at least painful. You know, there's a guy who in 2015, I don't even understand how he did this. You could ask Johnny afterwards, because he probably understands. But this guy in 2015 was able to research all the search terms typed into Google up until that point. And what he wanted to know is, what questions do people ask Google about God? His thesis, it would seem, is that there's going to be one level of transparency with a friend and another level of transparency with an authoritative figure. But what could be more safe and anonymous than Google? According to his research, here's the 6 most common questions asked up until that point. Why does God allow suffering? Why does God need so much praise? Why does God hate me? Why did God make me ugly? Why did God make me gay? Why did God make me black? What's the familiar thread? Disappointment, isn't it? What if Palm Sunday, what if first and foremost it's a snapshot of what we as spiritually minded religious people do when we're disappointed with God? What if it's a warning of the kind of emotional reaction we can adopt when God doesn't play within the rules that we're told he would play within? What if Palm Sunday is this reminder that God is more faithful to himself, to God's self, than he is to our language and our constructs and our culture? That God was king isn't on trial on Palm Sunday. The priorities and ways of that king, that's what was on trial. What if Palm Sunday reminds us that God is faithful And we see an evolution of this, dare we use the word, over even just the history of the Bible, that God is faithful to constantly be challenging our images for him and begging us to adopt images of him that are more consistent with who he is. Like, what if Palm Sunday reminds us that disillusionment isn't all bad? Now, disillusionment is this word that people like myself, I do it all the time. In fact, part of what gets me out of bed in the morning is creating a church that's for disillusioned people. But think about it. And again, this starts with Jonathan Narrate, and you can Google it. He's actually sparking some pretty good conversations on this topic. What does disillusionment mean? It means the loss of an illusion, which would mean it's not all bad, is it? It might mean we've given it a bad rap, because what it would mean is disillusionment is when a lie that we hold about ourselves, the world, those we love, God, others, it's when a lie is exposed and replaced with a truth. Now, Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a leader in local church world in our country, she makes this observation that disillusionment, the way she says it is, it's this sacred moment when we're exposed as small and creation smaller, a little bit bigger, excuse me. It's a sacred moment when we're exposed to be small and God reminds us how big God is. Now, I understand that disillusionment's not always comfortable, but listen to the way she says this. Go ahead to the next slide. She says, disillusioned, we find out what is not true and we're set free to seek what is, if we dare, to turn away from the God who is supposed to be in order to seek the God who is. And I guess I want to suggest this might really be the issue, that when our 1.0 image of God is challenged, we can walk away and just decide the whole thing was a waste of time. I mean, it's a little bit tricky to, on the one hand, say, your image for God is never going to be complete and perfect. It's always going to be getting turned upside down. There's a sense of like, okay, so why would I start? And I think she does a good job of just naming, yeah, that's what you've got to decide. Is a journey with God where he already tells you you're never going to nail him. You're never going to get God perfectly right. He will always be faithful to challenge you. Is that journey worth it? We look at, if we're not careful, we look at Palm Sunday and we assume that we would have been among the crowd going, don't crucify him, don't crucify him. And when we do that, that allows us to assume that they were bad. But what if we flip the script and we go, no, I'd have been along those street corners. And frankly, God would have loved me all the same, even though I had him so wrong in that moment. What if Palm Sunday is this time not to put a smiley face on your pain and your suffering, but in an honest sense, it's this way to remind ourselves that the journey towards faith is a lot like the journey to a lot of highly successful professions. Like I don't want a dentist who stops learning, do you? I don't want a teacher who got her degree 20 years ago and decided that he or she needs to know everything, that they already know everything they need to know about serving 7th grade students, do you? I want to be around learners. And I get it, like there's this slippery slope thing and we all get afraid because some of the heaviest guilt in the world is the guilt that your faith doesn't look like your parents. And you're not sure they would sign off on it. That's heavy. But what if Palm Sunday reminds us God is faithful to himself and he's constantly going to be challenging you and he's constantly going to be inviting you to reread the scripture and gain a greater sense of how God works in our lives. And to do that the whole time knowing you're never going to perfect it. And listen, I understand how offensive it could be to go like, so therefore your pain is for good. But what if as you move through the pain, whatever the discouragement, whatever the disappointment it is, what if God gives you permission to feel it? Yes, feel it. And begin to understand and ask this question, okay, God, how are you inviting me to know you better through this? And what if you were a part of a tradition of people who constantly ran the risk of being told, you've gone too far. You don't actually know God anymore. Like, why were Peter and Andrew and James and John and the disciples, why were they murdered? Because the people they grew up with in faith said, you've went off the deep end. There's no way Jesus could be God. There's no way God prioritizes people more than temple. Why would we think that our journey is supposed to look any different? What if Palm Sunday, Psalm 23, I've been mixing those up all week. What if Palm Sunday is an invitation to be reminded that you can't master God, but you don't have to master God to know him, and that knowing God is a journey, and that this God is faithful to who he is. And for the courageous, he'll lead you to those places. Listen, I don't know where the pain is. I don't know where the questions are. My hope is that Palm Sunday is this reminder that most people in this book's faith looks more like yours than the people that you've idolized off to the side. Let me pray. God, thanks, Lord, for these historic moments where you just show up and just shatter who it is you want to be known as and what priorities you want us to have. And God, we understand there's all these questions that run through our mind of how far does this go and where's the boundaries to this. And Lord, if nothing else, we just name that those are questions that every person who's ever tried to stay faithful to you had to deal with. And so, God, would you give us the courage to be faithful to what it is you've given us? And at the same time, would you give us the courage to constantly slow down and ask awareness and presence questions that invite us to understand how it is you might be tearing down some idols in our own hearts. We love you, God. Amen.
In a moment, our ushers are going to come forward with the offering. So if you take ownership in giving, you can prepare now. If not, or you're a guest with us, you can just let the buckets go right by you. Here at Narrate, we gather and we scatter. And we gather here on Sunday mornings, and we work hard to discuss topics that are relevant to you and your everyday lives. And then the rest of the week, we get into our community and we scatter. We serve and love people right where they're at. So this morning we're talking about Ales for Trails, and I realize it's kind of weird because Easter is this coming weekend and there's a lot happening with Easter, but this year Easter and Ales are very close to each other, so if we don't talk about Ales now, we'll miss some opportunities to get volunteers.
Yeah, so if this is your first spring with us or your first time around this whole thing called Hell and Ales for Trails, the shock of that, I suppose, needs to be named, that here we are as a church involved in this brew festival that's about, well, this is the 9th year, right?
Correct.
So this is the 9th version of this. So a little bit of context, from the very beginning, what we said was we wanted to be a place where the most ardent critic of Jesus would be bummed if we went away, which means that our opportunity is to try to identify things in the community that we can agree on, whereas churches are prone to just identify the things that they disagree about. And for us, an easy one, some low-hanging fruit there were these things called trails. And so it's what we did is we formed this crew, and it's a consortium of Narrate people and non-Narrate people and people who attend and people who have never and maybe never will attend, who kind of lead this thing. Whoa, it's changing. It's a special effect. It's to help sell tickets. So for years now, what we've been doing is building this thing led by a community of people, and frankly, who have built what is considered by many of the breweries one of the best beer festivals available in the state. And over the course of the first 8 years, we've raised $100,000, over $100,000 for trails. And so really, it's an opportunity for us to come alongside the community and serve alongside people at the event. It's like 150 people, is that right, to make this thing happen?
Just on the day of.
Yeah, true. Whew. Yeah, and then there's everything else. So we just have to name, like for some of you, alcohol is an issue. For some of you, it's something that you have to stay away from. Many of you are in recovery, and we totally respect that. We also are working on a scattering event that'll coincide with this one's. so that you're not left out in that whole realm. We did that last year as well. And the other thing is, because some of our brains tend to go to the defense of people in recovery, even if you yourself aren't. And we've done a lot of homework on this and a lot of research and had conversations with people from the drug treatment court and even friends involved with AA. And over again, what we hear is that people in recovery, they don't need more environments where they're sheltered. They need to do the internal work where they can be in any environment and thrive. So I get it. It's messy. Frankly, we lose people from Narrate every year because of this event. But for us, it's born of this value that we want to be a scattering community that's involved in the community and caring about the things the community cares about. And frankly, it's been such a fun journey of getting to know a lot of people who aren't necessarily connected to this place. And we go, wow, we have a lot in common. And suddenly there's these conversations that form. So Ales for Trails is messy. We get that. I mean, when that's lost on us, I hope we shut it down. It's not something that we're committed to doing forever because it's a lot of work. And every year we look at each other and go, do we want to do this again? And every year so far, that's been yes. Many of you are involved in sponsorship through your businesses. Thank you for that. We're at $19,000 in sponsorship this year, which is astounding, and that's what allows us to split the difference between what is a really good experience for the attendee and at the same time something that's successful in raising funds. So this year's project, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, it's fine.
This year, where the money is going is all the ladies in particular will be happy because they're putting a vaulted bathroom at the top of the Ridge Trail. So the guys are like, I don't need that. But in partnership with the Forest Service and City, Brad from City Parks and Open Lands, there's a bunch of money being poured into adding to that trailhead, putting a bathroom in, putting some wheelchair accessible things in there, putting a roundabout so the trail rider can actually pull in there and turn around rather than just drop you off on the street.
That's cool.
Yeah, and then that's the other thing that we're doing is the trail rider itself is in this kind of in-between year in its own funding. And so we've come alongside and said, hey, this year we would love to supplement it while you figure out how to fund that thing in the sustainable future. So that's where it's going this year. There's some big stuff in the works that we're excited about being a part of in the years that follow. Volunteering.
Yeah. So like Adam said, there's 150. It takes 150 volunteers to make just the day of ALES happen. So there's spots in every opportunity right now. I do have like a huge backlog of emails about ALES. So if you have emailed me to volunteer, I'll get to it on Tuesday, I promise. You don't have to fill out a sheet in the back. So we do have about a dozen spots open for setup, and that's the morning to a couple hours before the event. We have about 40 spots open to pour beer, if you'd like to pour beer at the event. When we do divide up all these into about 2-hour shifts, so you're not serving the whole thing, you still have time to enjoy the event. So if you'd like to pour, there is a training on Saturday, April 27th at the Blackfoot you need to attend. So just a heads up there. And then we have shifts for the event gates. That's checking IDs, stamping hands, ticket tables, selling tickets or scanning tickets that have already been purchased, selling merchandise. So that's the beer tokens, the plaques. And we're getting these really neat hoodies this year.
No, not hoodies. You said no hood.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, I keep messing that up because I use sweatshirt and hoodie interchangeably.
Yeah, but
no
Hannah,
hood,
if you missed the hood this year, it's her fault.
Sorry.
She was very no hood, no zipper. So it's
right.
It's what Australians would call a sweater.
The ALES merchandise is just what I'm missing in my wardrobe, right? Oh, I need one of those. Okay, sweatshirts. Sorry, we'll get that right. Now I forgot what else I'm missing. Teardown, and there's a whole bunch of spots if you want to check out at the Gather Scatter table in the lobby. And so there's a sheet. So grab a sheet and then fill out your top 3 choices, and then just hand it to Sheila's back there.
And volunteers get a free ticket to the main event?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, lots of opportunity. It's kind of a wild one. Things you didn't think you'd probably hear at church this weekend is, hey, we need you to pour beer here in a few weeks. And we get it. It's messy. Thanks for being the kind of community where we can try to get in the mess of culture and be a part of serving people and culture without strings attached. And the other thing that you should know is one of the value decisions that we made from the very beginning was that, so to speak, tithe dollars don't go into ALES. So Narrate sponsors the event. We're a $1,000 sponsor. Those are the only from our budget that go into the event. But there was this decision early on so as not to, for those of you who are conflicted at the event, to know that your giving minus those $1,000 doesn't touch the event. It's really a self-funded thing through sponsorship and ticket sales. So if you came this morning intending to give, you can do so now as the buckets come by.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.